Before she begins, she's asked me to keep it short, not out of false modesty, but because if I'm fast, then she can be fast, and then we can be fast to get to the, she said, poster session, but I think she meant drinks. So Wendy got her PhD in 2005 at the University of California at Santa Cruz, one of SPICY's better partners, a source of a lot of terrific SPICY members, I think. Wendy joined SPICY as a graduate student with a gift membership. Gift memberships are $10, and you can give them to students, and you are encouraged to do so. That starts people, and it started Wendy on her journey with the society, and so we're grateful for that. Who was the giver?
Faye Crosby.
Faye Crosby, longtime SPICY supporter. So 15 years later, Wendy Williams is SPICY through and through, teaching, activism, service to society, everything. Let me just tell you that she received a grant and aid for her dissertation. Yay, grant and aid. I think grant and aid is one of our better programs. In fact, one of our best. She's been chair of the graduate student committee. She was the chair of the Clara Mayo grants. She's been the book review editor for ASAP. She's represented SPICY to APA Council, which is hazard duty, I think, and we're very grateful for that. And she's given congressional briefings on SPICY-related issues. She is a first-rate creator of teaching materials. She's got a lot of teaching materials out there. You should see them. And they're mostly in the area of poverty, inequality, and social justice writ large. And so you have more stuff coming out too, I think, so this is going to be good for us. She taught at Marshall University for several years and left then as an associate professor and director of women's studies at Marshall, and went to Berea College in 2011. And if you don't know Berea College, it's a tuition-free liberal arts college with SPICY values, clearly. And I quote from their own values. Their values are love over hate, human dignity and equality, and peace with justice. It's really a SPICY institution, I think, which is terrific. And let me tell you, on a more personal note, Wendy followed me as president, and I don't want to say I left a big mess at the end of the presidency, but there were a lot of things that needed care and attention, follow through, and knowledge and commitment. And Wendy has been absolutely amazing in terms of her attention to detail, in terms of knowing what needs to be done, in terms of getting it done. She has been completely awesome. She's been as good as the society deserves. And so please join me in welcoming Wendy Williams.
All right, I'm setting my timer because I'm really going to try and stay on time with you all. It really is a pleasure to be here tonight with you all, and this talk is actually culminating in several years of thinking about this as sort of related to what Chris said. There's a 3-year cycle for the SPICY presidency. So you are elected, then you're president-elect for a year, then you're president, then you're past president. So I actually found out that I was going to be president in the summer of 2016. And so even at that point, you know, maybe it may have been my second thought. I think my first thought was yay. My second thought was like, oh my gosh, I have to give a presidential address, right? So I've been thinking about this for quite a while. And I knew even then that I would want to talk with you about poverty and wealth and inequality and what our science has to say about it and how we can apply it to public policy, but I really wasn't sure exactly what the framework was going to be until 2 things fell into place. And the first one of these was actually the decision for us to come to Pittsburgh, so for SPICY to be in Pittsburgh. And I cannot say that I knew a whole lot about Pittsburgh, but one of the things that I did know is that one of its most famous citizens is Andrew Carnegie. And again, I can't say I knew a whole lot about Andrew Carnegie, but one of the things that I did know was that he amassed great wealth in his lifetime, but then set about giving that wealth away. And one of the ways that he is famous for giving his wealth away is by giving of libraries to places where people didn't have access access to libraries. And one of the reasons that I know that is actually my office at Berea College is in a former Carnegie library. Okay, and so you can see from our archives a picture on the left-hand side of what the library looked like shortly after 1905 when he donated money and the building was built. And on the right-hand side, what it looks like today, which is actually, they haven't changed the outside. That's what it looked like when it was built as well. If you're curious, my window is the top window on the left-hand side. So you can imagine me now sitting in my office thinking about, okay, so we're going to Pittsburgh, Carnegie, that seems like that's something to hold on to. But again, like I said, I didn't know a whole lot about Carnegie. So I want to tell you a little bit about it. I did a little investigating on Carnegie. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things that I found out about him. He was actually born in Scotland, and so he was an immigrant. He came over with his family at the age of 13, and they came to Allegheny, Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh. And they settled there, and his father took over a weaving business. But unfortunately, the weaving business failed very shortly after they got here. And so Carnegie went out into the community, out into the cotton mills, and actually to work to start to support the family. And from there, he worked from the cotton mills into the telegraph business, into the railroad business. Since he was working, he wasn't educated in a formal sense, but he was self-educated. And one of the ways that he was self-educated was actually through the generosity of a local citizen, Colonel Anderson, who opened up his vast private library actually to working men, working boys in the community. And so if you look at the history of Carnegie and sort of his story, what you see is that he took a number of risks over time. He did some investments that then paid off, that he then continued to invest and take these risks. And was very sort of an early adopter of some of the industry, so in oil and in steel, and that's really how he's made his fortune. And if you look at his narrative, he very much sort of reifies this idea of that American dream, that rags to riches, right? So coming over as an immigrant, working hard through his hard work, his luck, his skill, his initiative, and now he's amassed this great wealth. Okay, and so his story doesn't stop there, though. He decided to retire at the age of 60 and to set about to actually then give away his wealth. Okay, and so this graph is actually from the Carnegie Foundation, and they put it together a number of years ago, but I still think that it's useful for us to sort of get a sense of how much wealth are we talking about. And they did adjust it for inflation, but this gives you a sense of the time, and again, it's a little bit old data, but at the time, some of the top of the Forbes 400 list, to give you a sense of today, when we tend to think of individuals who have massive wealth in our society, and again, this is in billions, by the way, the amount of wealth that Carnegie had compared to some of the people who we think of as having massive wealth today. So I think that's helpful to give us just a little bit of context of how much money we're talking about. I think it's also helpful to give us some context about what else was happening at the time that he was starting to think about giving his money away. So this is actually from a report in 1896 about data from 1890. And what you can see here is when Carnegie is starting to think about what to do with his wealth, there is in fact vast economic inequality in the United States. So this table, just very briefly, you can see at the top echelons, so not very many people, not very many families, but about half of the wealth. And then if you look, you can see towards the bottom, many, many more people, a lot less of the wealth, right? So vast economic inequality. All right, so Carnegie starts to be thinking about how does he want to get rid of his wealth, and he starts to write down his thoughts on what he thinks is the obligation of people of wealth to give away their wealth. And so he publishes his thoughts in 1889. They've become known as the Gospel of Wealth, and he basically says that he thinks that there are 3 ways to dispose of wealth. The first is that you can leave it to your family. And he's not overly impressed by any means for this particular idea. He tends to think that this really is unjust and very, very unwise. It doesn't do any good to the children or to the community. And you can see the quote here. He says, "The thoughtful man must shortly say, I would as soon leave my son a curse as the almighty dialer, and admits to himself that it's not the welfare of the children, but the family pride which inspires us these enormous legacies." And I just, as a parenthetical note, I thought about putting sick after every time he says man and him in all of these quotes I'm going to show you, and it made it too clunky, so let's just all in our heads, we'll just agree to that. Okay. So he doesn't think a whole lot of just giving it to the kids. So what's the next way? So a second option he said that you have is you can bequeath it for public purpose after death. And again, Carnegie not thinking a whole lot of this option either. He basically says this is the way you get rid of wealth, but it's really not about wealth distribution, which is really what he was going for. And he also is not overly impressed with this idea because he's like, what other option do you have? right? You cannot take it with you, right? So I'm not overly impressed with you when you give it away after you're gone. Okay, so, and again here, the quote from him, besides this, it may fairly be said that no man is to be extolled for doing what he cannot help doing, nor is he to be thanked by the community for which he leaves only wealth at death. Men who live vast sums in this way may fairly be thought men who would not have left it at all had they been able to take it with them. All right, so what does Carnegie actually think we should be doing? Okay, so he says the third way that we can do this is we can actually administer it during a lifetime. In other words, give it away while we're still alive. Okay, and this is the one that he thinks is actually going to be the antidote to this. And he really does see income inequality as a temporary thing, right? So what he's trying to do is say, like I came through my lifetime, this is, I amassed it, so I give it away. And that's how we make sure that we don't have this perpetuating inequality over time. And again here, his quote, he says, the best means of benefiting the community is to place within its reach the ladders upon which the aspiring can rise, public institution of various kinds, which will improve the general condition of the people, in this manner returning their surplus wealth to the mass of their fellows in the forms best calculated to do them lasting good. Okay. All right, so I'm going to pause here for a second and say, if you remember, if you were paying attention, I said there are two things that help me think about framing, and I gave you one, right? So Andrew Carnegie, many of you, if you were paying attention to the title of my talk, you can guess the next one, and that would be all right, the election of President Trump. So very much these two things, and I was starting to already read about Carnegie at the time that Trump was elected, and I was like, okay, yeah, so there's something here in terms of thinking about some comparisons. And so for those comparison purposes, you may know some of these details, but I thought it would just be helpful for us to run through some of these same demographic kinds of details. Although he is not an immigrant himself, his mother is actually an immigrant, also from Scotland, so they share Scottish heritage. She came over at the age of 18. And they both, in a form, left the house at 13. He instead went to a military academy to help him focus. That's what they said. He was more formally educated than you can see in terms of self-education. In terms of his work, right, so slightly different industries, but still making money in terms of investing and risk-taking, putting together complicated deals. But in this case, in terms of the real estate business. And in terms of striking it on his own, not so much, really following in his father's business. So he worked in his father's business in summers and after he graduated, and so really sort of moving up through his father's business that way. He definitely tries to cultivate an idea or an image of being sort of a self-made man, and this idea of an American dream and the appearance of philanthropy. So I'm going to talk about those two things next. All right, so in terms of this idea of thinking about a self-made man, he has been quoted as saying that life has not been easy for him, that in fact he had to start his first business, he had to take a loan from his dad, and he had to pay it back with interest. What's often not talked about there is the loan was actually $1 million, was what he borrowed from his father. And at the time, his father's real estate holdings totaled about $150 million in terms of the holdings, and it was generating rents of about $50 million every year. Okay. He also took this loan in 1973. By 1974, he's in charge of his father's company, right? So it's possible he paid back that with interest, but he also was in charge of the company at the time. So I'm not really sure, I'll put the question mark. You can decide for yourself whether that fits your idea of self-made man. Philanthropist, and I know you can't see this, but I just love the graphic of this. So in terms of thinking about his philanthropy, I'm not the first one to ask this question. In fact, an investigative reporter for the Washington Post was really interested in a lot of Trump's claims about the money that he had given to different things, and so set about contacting 420 different organizations that had some connection to Trump or his businesses to find out if, in fact, they could verify any donations that Trump had made to those organizations. And so basically what this graphic is, it's just all the investigative journalist's notes, but it's all online. So if you actually want to page through them, you can actually take a look at it yourself. And what they found is during an 8-year period between 2008 and 2016, they could only verify one donation out of Trump's own pocket, and found lots of instances in which he promised money, but then actually never sent the check, or he did pay some money out of his foundation. But for money that's coming just from him out of his own pocket, they can only verify one in that 8-year period. So again, I'll let you decide whether you think that's philanthropic. All right, and I sort of feel like with apologies to the Carnegie Foundation, I might have followed their graph just a little bit. I figured you might be interested in where he fits onto this same graph. And again, you can see, so again, this is in billions of dollars, so although significantly less than Carnegie's wealth, more money than I'm guessing anyone in this room will see. And if not, talk to me about your stock options. Okay, so the context now, right? So we talked a little bit about some of the demographic. What about the context that they're in? Well, if you've been paying attention for the last 20 years, you'll hear this news about this growing economic inequality that we're having in the United States, and in fact globally. So this graph actually comes out of a World Inequality Report in 2018, looking at inequality across the globe. And what you can see here is over basically about a 30-year period, those 1%, top 1% of the United States, their share of the national income has raised from about 11% to about 20%, so that's the top 1% is increasing over 35 years, that amount. And at the same time, the bottom 50% of the United States, they have lost their share of income, moving down from about 20% to about 13%. And again, the comparison here with Western Europe, I think, is helpful, right? So this is a world issue. We're not the only ones. But I think also in terms of thinking about who do we see as our peers, we're far outpacing our peers here. And I'm not sure this is where we want to be far outpacing our peers, but nonetheless, we are. All right, so I've given you some demographic and I've given you some contextual setup here. It's also, I think, important to think about what did they actually believe. And so I've given you just a little bit of sense of some of Carnegie's beliefs here. But if you look at their writings and their speech, there you see really consistent, strong support for capitalism, a belief that poverty is a result of character flaws, and a valuing of hard work. And so this is a quote from Carnegie, where he says, in bestowing charity, the main consideration should be to help those who help themselves. Okay, so again, we can start to see some of these similarities and differences. And so as we start to think about what is their legacy on our science, I think it's important then to sort of put a pin here for just a moment and to consider our legacy first. So since this is SPICY, I think we need to think about where have we come in our science, thinking about social class and poverty. So we actually have a very long history in terms of studying these issues in the organization. So we were founded in 1936, and this was time during the Great Depression. And mirroring what we have seen consistently through the organization is that we are consistently involved in whatever the major social issues are of the day, right? So that we're looking to see, to answer the questions of the day. And so if you look at the research that's done here, we are absolutely all over looking at issues of employment, labor unions, and if you look at this, you can see the roots of research on classist attitudes, classist stereotypes, and collective action, right? It goes all the way back to the founding of the organization. Now there is a lull in the 1940s and 50s. You see a little bit less research, a little bit less emphasis on here. And again, in the same way that our attention is sort of captured by the social issues of the day, there are other social issues of the day, right? So 40s and 50s, we start to turn our attention post-World War II to thinking about issues of desegregation, of academic freedom, right? And it's not until the 1960s again, in Johnson's War on Poverty, that again you start to see more researchers focusing on these issues again. And the civil rights movements, again, I think is really instrumental here as well. And again, you can see some of the research, some of the roots of the stuff that I'll be talking about in a little while. So this idea of looking at the motivation of people who have less economic resources, their personality, an analysis of starting to look at legitimizing ideologies and our beliefs about mobility, as well as looking at health and well-being. Okay, and I think it's also important to see, you start to see, and I think really much coming out of the civil rights movements, an emphasis on starting to really examine structures here and looking at privilege, not just at poverty as well, and putting this in a global context. All right, and like we saw for the 1940s and 50s, again, there's a dip after that, and although there is sort of a small band of hardcore researchers who never give up during that time, we do see sort of a dip in the research, and again, then a rising of interest in social class here in the 2000s, and especially in the early 2000s, as we have a number of social issues. So I think Hurricane Katrina, I think Occupy Wall Street, and the Great Recession, right, as all as factors that start to call our attention to this widening inequality. And again, I think our research then also starts to mature here. We're starting to look at the research using social class as an independent variable, a dependent variable, as well as a contextual variable, as well as really paying attention to the issue that when we're looking at social class, we cannot always strip it away from everything else, right? We have to be taking an intersectional approach and understanding that there are connections, especially when we're talking about poverty, with other social groups. So we have to be looking at gender, we have to be looking at race, ethnicity, as well if we really want to understand things. Okay, so using that as our context then, what in fact do we think about poor people when we're looking at the views, and I'm going to take sort of for each of these science areas, what do we think about people who have less economic resources or more, and then what is the consequence for individuals who are living in those situations. So in terms of thinking about what we believe about low-income people, pretty consistently what the research shows here, they're viewed negatively, they're blamed for their circumstances. We're making these individualistic attributions, right? They're poor because they're not working hard enough, they're lazy. And you see that this is relatively unchanged over time. So if you look at historical data, you look at sociological data, it doesn't go back just to the Carnegie, some of the quotes that I showed you from there, it goes back to the founding of our country, over 400 years, right? And even before that if you want to go back to England, right? So blaming the poor for their situation. This is true even for low income as well as high income populations. So although low income individuals are more likely to see the structural barriers to escaping poverty, they're still also endorsing some of these same individualistic attributions. And unfortunately, this begins at a really young age. So kids are aware of the content of these stereotypes at a very young age. Okay, and these beliefs actually have consequences, right? We know this from some of our basic social psychology, right? So these attitudes then lead to behavior, and in particular to classist behavior. And this is both in interpersonal and institutional domains, right? So we then are treating people who have less resources as less, and we see this in our educational system, in our housing, and in our healthcare. All right, so I just do want to give you one example of research that is documenting some of this classism. And this research is actually coming out of research during the Great Recession. And so researchers were interested in whether, in fact, there was some discrimination against individuals who had been unemployed for a long period of time, right? So the recession, basically what we're seeing is that workers are taking a longer time to get back into the workforce. So is it possible that in fact the longer you've been out, the more that you're being discriminated against? Okay, so what these researchers did was a randomized field study where they sent out 3,000 fictitious resumes to 100 actual companies that were advertising jobs. And then they looked to see, did they get callbacks for those resumes? Okay, and they kept, in good experimental tradition, they kept everything the same, so the skills, qualification, education, lots of the things were the same, and they only varied a couple of different factors. And one of the factors that they varied was the length of time that the person's resume showed that they had been unemployed, right? Had they been unemployed 3 months, had they been unemployed 12 months. Okay, and what you can see here then is from the graph, you can see what they came to term an unemployment cliff. Right, so between about 6 months and about 8 months, you can see this precipitous drop in the likelihood of getting a callback. Okay, and so in terms of thinking about what's going on here, so why do we see this? May not be super surprising to us, might be surprising. We might not have predicted at that particular time point that we would see that drop. But so what's going on here? Can we explain this using our psychology? Right, so thinking about some of the stuff that I just told you in terms of the roots of this discrimination, certainly we can connect this back to some of the negative attitudes, right? So you could imagine the people who are looking at these resumes thinking, if you've been out of work for a period of time, right, and a longer period of time, and you're not back in work, that must indicate that you're not really working that hard, right? And so if I have an option between other resumes, I might say, well, you don't appear to be a very hard worker, right? Because that is connecting to my conceptualization of social class as achieved. So I'm using, this is terms from Irving Goffman. We see social class as achieved as something that over a lifetime that we are able to control. Right? So we see social class as something within people's control. This is in comparison to the idea that some classes or some memberships are in fact ascribed. They're given to us at birth. There's nothing that we can do about them. Right? And I think one of the things to think about in terms of social class, we tend to think about social class not as something that is ascribed at birth, but actually something that we achieve over our lifetime. And so thinking about the roots of this, right, this is a very different conceptualization than in terms of explaining why we might be discriminated against because of these negative beliefs we have, particularly about social class. Okay. Well, so are they right? I mean, so is it possible that in fact that it's something about the individual that in fact is causing them to be more likely unemployed for a longer period of time? And in fact, there's some research that was done during the same time, during the Great Recession, that actually showed that the biggest factor in becoming a long-term unemployed individual was actually the state of the economy as measured by the unemployment rate at the time that you lost your job. Okay, so parsing that out, what that means is when you lost your job, played a bigger role in whether you stayed long-term unemployed than they looked at your race, your age, your occupation, your education. Right? So it mattered more what the state of the economy was when you lost your job than any of the other factors that were really sort of about you. So in other words, it wasn't about things that were under your control, right? It was about the state of the economy when you lost your job. Okay, this is in some ways the definition of a structural barrier, right? In thinking about this, I think this is really helpful for us to see that both not only is it sort of us saying, oh no, they're working hard, but actually some data that shows it doesn't matter, in fact, if they're working hard or not, right? It matters what the state of the economy is. Okay, I'm going to give you some other ways to think about this. And another way to think about this really comes out of a really wonderful paper by Greenwald and Pettigrew. And in this paper, basically, they're starting from this idea that we like those who like us, right? So really classic research in social psychology. And they wondered if they could better explain some discriminatory behavior rather than as out-group hostility, that I'm discriminating against you because I don't like your group. Could we explain some of this as I'm actually favoring my group? It actually doesn't really have to do with you, right? It has to do with I like the people who are like me, so I'm going to choose the people like me. Okay, now I'm going to be really careful here to say, and they were very careful to say, it's not that out-group hostility doesn't occur, right? And what they're saying is it possible that in fact, in some instances, some of the de facto discrimination that we're seeing is actually a favoring of people who are like us rather than a hostility against people who are not like us? Okay, and I really like this as an explanation for potentially thinking about, for lots of things, but in particular, why someone might choose not choose one of these applications, right? So if I am an employed person, right, and many of my friends are employed people, I'm going to like people who are employed because they're like me, right? And the longer you are unemployed, the more you are not like me, right? In which case, then, I'm going to favor the people who are more like me rather than the people who are not like me. And I think one of the advantages of this is really thinking about that you don't necessarily have to be overtly prejudiced in order for your behavior to be discriminatory, right? And so I think that this is something to help us to think about, again, thinking about kinds of interventions. If we're always assuming hostility or negative out-group stuff, and again, not to say that that's not part of it, but that may not be all of it. Okay, so switching now, we're spending time thinking about our beliefs about people who have less resources. What is the experience of being someone who has less resources? And I think the research here is pretty consistent. It's not good, right? Lots of negative outcomes associated with poverty across a variety of domains. So looking at cognitive domains, behavioral domains, all kinds of psychological domains as well. And so rather than sort of running through all of this, I want to give you one study, but I want to spend a little bit of time on this study because, again, I think it's helping advance our science and thinking a little bit differently than we have in the past about this. And this is actually the book by Nathan and Shafir on scarcity. If you have not read this book, please put it on your summer reading list. I think it is, for me, it was really sort of a transformative book in terms of thinking about this issue. And what Nathan and Shafir were interested in is they were looking at a variety of what appears on the surface to be very different things, different phenomena that are going on. They're interested in poverty and scarcity of money. They were interested in very busy individuals, which if you think about it in the same sort of scarcity idea, are people who are scarce of time, dieters who are scarce of food, right, or people who are lonely, so scarcity of social attention. So they go through a variety of things that might seem very disparate. And their hypothesis is, if you think about these in that scarcity framework, they start to make sense. And what you start to see is an awful lot of commonalities between these things. So before I move into giving sort of their explanation of this, I want to give you an example and see if maybe this might resonate with anyone else in the room here. So let's say there's a conference that you're super excited about going to. Okay, and so you find out about this conference in December, and let's just say you're actually invited to give a keynote address, and so you're super honored, and so you say, yes, of course, I would love to do that. And then the next thing you know, the 5 undergraduates that you've been working with all decide they want to go to the conference too, because they've heard from you what a wonderful conference it is, and so they all want to submit posters, and so you're like, yeah, bring it on, come on, everyone, let's go, right? And then it's the spring semester, and you have a full teaching load because you teach at a small liberal arts college, and so you have a lot of teaching responsibilities, and then your husband says to you, in fact, let's go study abroad group of students to Denmark and Sweden, right? 15 of them for 4 weeks, leading up to the 2 weeks before your conference. Does that sound good to you? You say, yeah, that sounds great. Okay. No one? Anyone? Okay. So now it's 2 weeks before your big talk, right? And although you've been thinking about it for 2 years, you really just sort of like jotted a few things on a piece of paper over here and jotted a little over there. 2 weeks before, you have no talk, right? In essence, you don't have a talk. You have some abstracts, right? Because you had to submit those in December. But you have no posters, right? So what you may have done, right? You might have like locked yourself in a room and you're typing some pretty furiously to get some stuff out there, and actually sort of lo and behold, it's actually going pretty good, right? It's just, it's flowing, and what before had been like, oh, I'm not really sure how this is all going to fit together, right? You ran the moment and you're flowing and it seems to be going really good, and the next thing you know, it's time to get on your plane to go to the conference, and you're packing your stuff, and you actually just sort of look around your house and it doesn't quite look exactly like you thought when you were working before, and you followed one of those highly effective habits and you turned off your email while you were working and you turn it back on, and now your email looks like this, and as you're getting ready to leave, maybe your partner is looking at you like this because you've been ignoring them for the last 2 weeks, and you look down and maybe always put the picture of your dog at the top. Always put the picture of your dog. I do actually think I felt like sort of obligated to be like dramatization of the hand, the house, the email, actual partner, maybe dramatization of the look that he gave me, my actual dog while I'm actually writing this actual talk. All right, so let's put this in Noel, Nathan, and Shafir's terms here, okay? So what they say is, what they're trying to explain here is that there actually is some good things that come out of scarcity. When we are scarce of time, and maybe you have felt this before, right? You have this incredible ability to focus on the task in front of you, right? And so what they call this is a focus dividend. So scarcity then really captures our mind, and we're able to focus on the thing that we need to focus on, okay? And so this is a really wonderful thing. The downside of this is as we're focusing on this thing, and they sort of call this tunneling, right? We're tunneling in on the thing that's right in front of us. They use this language really particular to call the mind a sort of tunnel vision, right? To give you the idea that in fact, the things that are falling out of your focus, right? That there actually could potentially be a tax here, right? That there are other things that are happening around you that you can't give your attention to, right? That are falling outside of that. And that there are often consequences of things falling outside of that tunnel. Right, so for example, I could explain, right, both how I was able to do the things that I needed to do, and at the same time, all of these other things just sort of fell out of my vision. All right, but they say it's even more than that, right? So it's not just that we sort of have these positives and these negatives, but in fact, if you think about all of us have sort of a cognitive capacity, right? And if you think about this in terms of all of your ability to do all kinds of fluid thinking and fluid intelligence, all of us have a certain amount of that. You say, under these scarce kind of conditions, because the thing that's right in front of us captures our attention, that leaves less of our bandwidth, right? Less of our ability then to focus on these other things. Okay, and so they call this our bandwidth tax. And it both means that, in fact, we don't have enough bandwidth to deal with those other things. So for example, like maybe you cheated. Let me go over here for a second. Maybe you cheated just a little bit and you looked at your email, right? And there was an email and there's sort of like a minor emergency, but you're like, oh, I don't have time for this, right? And so you don't give it any of your attention, right? Except that later on, after you finish your talk and you actually go read the email, now all of a sudden it's blown up, right? And now it's this huge thing where if you had given it just a little bit of time at the moment, you could have dealt with it. Now it's this much, much bigger thing. Okay, so you're getting this idea, right? This tax that we don't have the ability then to focus on all of these other things. The other thing that is going on is we also, in terms of this bandwidth idea, and again, they're sort of using very loose cognitive terms here, right, to encompass a lot of more complicated things. But we also don't have our ability in terms of executive control, like our ability to then move our focus. So not only is it capturing our attention, we have real difficulty then using that executive function to move our attention away. And maybe you've also experienced this before. So let's say I'm working my talk and my partner comes to me and says, you've been working really hard, let's go out to dinner, right? Let's leave this alone for a little while, come out with me, we'll go out to dinner. You say, okay, yeah, that's probably right, I probably should, work balance, whatever. Right? So you go to dinner and you're sitting there and the whole time you're thinking about your talk, right? Like you cannot focus at all, right? So this is that idea of that just because normal situations, right, we have that ability to move our focus around, under these scarce conditions, we lose that ability. Okay, so making our connection then, so you sort of get this idea of scarcity of time. Now thinking about in terms of poverty, in terms of scarcity of resources. So again, all of this is in Mullinath and Shafir's books, right? So I'm just sharing with you their ideas. They give the example of payday lenders as an example that sort of has a nice parallel to the same sorts of things that I've been talking about. And so if you're not familiar with payday lenders, basically what this is for individuals who are having trouble, like so for example, you need to pay your rent like tomorrow and you don't have enough money to make your rent tomorrow, you can go to one of these payday lenders and they will give you an advance on your paycheck for next month. Okay, so they're giving you money now for taking out of your paycheck for next month. Okay. In your tunnel, right, if your tunnel is, I need to pay rent now or else I'm going to be out on the street, right, all of a sudden having this money dangled in front of you, right, seems like a wonderful solution, right? This is a fabulous solution to your problem. Okay, the problem is because you're tunneled in on how am I going to get this money, you're not really seeing all those things that outside the tunnel. And one of the things that's outside the tunnel is the fact that these payday lenders charge exorbitant fees for giving you that loan. Okay, so oftentimes, and again what this cartoon is getting at is sort of that loan shark kind of idea, right? So exorbitant fees for then giving you this advance. Okay, and again, think this through, right? So if you have trouble meeting your expenses this month, next month, not only you're probably also likely going to have trouble to meet those expenses, now you have to pay this loan, right? And how are you going to pay this loan? Okay, and so if this hasn't convinced you, there's sort of parallels. I strongly recommend you read their book. There's lots of evidence in this book to make this connection. And ultimately, where they come away with it is because of the evidence that they're able to put together, that all people, if they are poor, have less effective bandwidth. Okay, and what they're really getting at here is oftentimes we want to blame the poor for what we see are bad choices, right? So as we're standing out here outside of things, it doesn't make sense for you to take this loan, right, to charge these fees, right? You can see where this is going to go if you're not in a scarcity mindset. Right? So the same way, like, you probably could have forecast, maybe you already were when I was giving you my slides, like how that was going to go, right? Like, I wasn't going to be able to do all of the things, right? So, so in this situation, the kinds of decisions that I was making are the same kinds of decisions that people under scarce resources are also making. And yet we really judge the people who are in poverty, and we don't make the same kind of judgments about people who are acting under scarce resources in terms of dieting or loneliness or in terms of time. And this is, I think, even more particularly a problem because the consequences for people in poverty is even more severe, right? So again, so coming back to my example, the other thing that I didn't say is I actually start sabbatical. What time do we finish? Noon on Sunday. That's about when my sabbatical starts. And so what are the consequences for me, right? So my house is a mess. So I go home and I clean my house, right? I spend a little extra time with my dog and my partner, right? I start answering my emails. No harm, no foul, right? In essence, okay. But for low-income people in particular, there isn't a sabbatical from poverty, if you will, right? Like, maybe that sounds like a cool idea, but not something that we currently have anyways, or at least I'm not aware of, so please let me know if you know of something like that. But so using this idea then, I think one of the other things that I really like about this is it moves us away from pathologizing people in low-income situations, right? Because if we would act in the exact same way, it becomes much harder for us to say those people make bad decisions. All right, so now in terms of thinking about our science, coming out of this literature then, what is agenda? It was really funny, they were like, what's your title? And I was like, well, it's going to have a science and policy agenda. And I was like, man, I'm going to have to come up with an agenda then, right? So thinking about my agenda, if you will, is I think it still is important, although this is one of our older bodies of literature in terms of documenting classism, I still think that this is important for us to do, not just documenting classism, but also its effects. And in particular, I think you can see in terms of the Great Recession, where still as different social issues are coming up, I think continuing to document this becomes important. I think it's also really important for us to continue to have interdisciplinary approaches to classism. So, for example, the research that I showed you by Mullinath and Shafir, one of them is an economist, right? Lots of the stuff that we know about people living in poverty is from sociologists, right? In order for us to understand the full complexity here, we're going to have to be talking to people who are not just psychologists. Okay, now this isn't to say that I actually don't think that psychologists are playing a really important role here. I actually do think we have a really important role to play here. Not only in terms of some of the basic psychology that we already know helps us explain the situations that are occurring to low-income people. And focusing on processes like we see here in terms of using some of our cognitive science to explain scarcity, I think helps us get at why without pathologizing. And that's really, I think, an important thing for us to keep in mind. Okay, so moving on to thinking about, and again, moving to wealth and thinking about what are our beliefs about wealth, as well as what are the consequences of wealth on us. You can see in terms of our ideology about wealth, our beliefs about wealth, the same sort of individualistic kinds of attributions. In really lots of ways, the flip side of what we see for poverty, right? So if people are poor because they're not hardworking, well then people are wealthy because they've worked really hard, right? They've got a lot of initiative, they've got a lot of pluck, a lot of skill, right? And so that's why they're wealthy. So same sort of individualistic kinds of attributions. It's about them as an individual. And overall, if you sort of look at this body of literature, we tend to see wealth itself also as a very positive thing. Okay, now that's not to say that we don't see some of the downsides of wealth. And you see this more coming through when we talk about the character of individuals who have wealth or affluence. And I tend to think here, that's why I have Michael Douglas down in the corner there from Wall Street, if you've ever seen the original movie. And his character, Gordon Gekko, in that sort of famously says greed is good, right? So this sort of idea that wealthy people are greedy, that they're corrupt, that they're inconsiderate. And I do think our Occupy Wall Street movement here has again refocused us on some of these ideas, pointed out to us very specific examples of wealthy individuals and some of these negative traits. But I think we still don't problematize wealth in the same way that we do with poverty, right? We tend to, and again, if you think about this in terms of thinking about research, when we say what are our social problems, we typically list poverty, but we don't always say wealth, right? So I think in terms of thinking about the way that we problematize things, I think that's really important. Now, again, I think this is one of the really interesting and exciting areas that the research is moving into, and I think really coming out of some of this Occupy Wall Street, focusing on the wealthy. We do see some research here about the negative sides of wealth, so we're starting to focus in on what is the experience of having money. And there are some negative things. So research finding that wealthy individuals, looking at some of the, coming out of the power in relationships research, that individuals who have more wealth are more disengaged in interpersonal interactions. So things like fidgeting with things or doodling, rather than actually giving eye contact to the person or smiling, that you find that they're less likely to follow rules, wealthy people less likely to follow rules, some research there, as well as to engage in more unethical behavior. So I want to give you an example of this actually from this PIF study. There's actually 7 studies in this article, so I'm just going to give you 2 of them that I think sort of get at some of what this research is showing. And so one of the reasons that I like this study is, so Piff and his colleagues actually went out into the world, which I always encourage us to go out into the world. And what they did was they actually looked to see if there was a relationship between the expensiveness of cars that people drove and their engagement in unethical, so they're sort of calling unethical behavior, or sort of negative behaviors, right? So thinking about kind of negative driving behaviors in particular. And so they looked at 4-way stops, okay, and whether individuals, the wealth of the car, the expensiveness of the car, indicated whether the individual actually yielded appropriately or cut off one of the other drivers. In other words, went out of turn. Okay. They also looked at intersections where there were crosswalks, and if there was someone who was trying to cross at the crosswalk, right, so if they're walking up to the crosswalk, does the car actually stop and let the person cross, or do they go ahead and through the intersection? Okay, and x-axis there, you can see they did some observational ratings of the expensiveness of the car, so how much the car costs, and the y-axis, the amount of these unethical behaviors and negative behaviors. So you can see this positive relationship, right? So as the perceived expensiveness of the car went up, more likely to engage in these negative driving kinds of behaviors. Okay, so now turning to this sort of our science agenda, my science agenda here in terms of wealth, I think it's really important for us to start to think about interventions here. And this is one of the reasons where I'm not fully convinced that we have fully embraced this idea that wealth is problematic, right? Because if we think that something is a problem, then we want to intervene on it. And we're a little light right now on these interventions, right? So if we understand that wealthy people are engaging in unethical behavior, where are interventions to teach them not to be unethical, right? And we're not quite there yet. And so I think this is a direction that we need to go as well. Another potential problem, I think, for this literature is access to the truly wealthy. And again, I do like the PIF study, but I think there's at least one problem here, right? Is just because you're driving an expensive car doesn't in fact mean that you're wealthy, right? It's very possible that you're driving how you think wealthy people drive, right? Would be one potential explanation there. So thinking about getting access to the truly wealthy, and in some sociological and journalistic research that has actually gotten access to truly wealthy people, we're really talking about 1% here, what they have found is it's actually incredibly difficult to get them to participate in the research and to get them to talk about their wealth. Okay, and so this is really an access kind of problem. And if we think about this, I think we really need to think about what can we offer them, right? So if I'm saying this is a problem, we need to get them into our research. What are we going to offer them, right? What are the typical things that we offer people? Money, right? Or are we, let's say like a little amount of money, right? It's not even like lots of money. We give them a little bit of money, or we give them some extra credit, right? So this has worked okay for us, right, in terms of getting poor people into our research, or at least poor people who are trying to get an education into our research. I think we got to think about some other strategies, about ways to convince them that in fact that it's important for them to participate in our research. All right, so we also need to clarify some contradictions. So again, this is a sort of a newer body of literature, but already we're starting to see some contradictions in the literature, and in particular, seeing things around charitable contributions. So there is sort of a debate in the literature about whether wealthy people actually are more generous, or in fact they're less generous. And so you could sort of maybe think of this as the Carnegie side versus the Trump side of philanthropy, right? So which one is actually giving away lots of money, which one not so much. And so I think we have this lesson from lots of our body of research already. Probably what's happening here are some moderators and some mediators, right? And so we need to be thinking about, are there other things that could possibly explain these potential contradictions? So potentially, like, are you serving on a board of a nonprofit, right? So oftentimes part of that is then you are giving money to the nonprofit. So if you're part of a community of giving, could that explain what's going on? Okay, so moving to inequality in terms of thinking about perceivers' views again. So what do we think about inequality? And what this research pretty consistently shows is there's much more income inequality than Americans actually realize. And you may be actually familiar with this actual study, even if you haven't read the study, because there was a viral video that went around a couple of years ago actually showing the data from this study. So this is Norton and Arelli's research, and what they did in this research, and if you don't know what video I'm talking about, just Google it, you'll find it, it's very popular. What they did, and I know, I'm sorry, this is hard to see up here at the front. What they did was they gave people different distributions of wealth, and they said, which one of these distributions of wealth across the different classes is the one that you think is the most ideal? And what they found was 92% of Americans thought that this conception here, so basically these green bars, and what you can see, if you can basically just see, it's mostly a flat line with a little bit at the end. Basically what this is showing is that they think that wealth should be distributed pretty evenly across the groups, right? Maybe we'll give the wealthy just a little bit, we'll cut them a break, right? We'll give them a little bit more there to the end, okay? So that's what they think is ideal. They then ask those same people, what do you think it actually is, right? So that's what you think is ideal. What do you think is actually happening in the United States? And what you can see here now, and again, even if you can't see it very well, is you see that it rises sort of dramatically. And I think this is really interesting because what it's illustrating is, although people want more equality of income, they actually know that it isn't, right? They're aware that, in fact, incomes are not very equal. Okay, and here's where it goes one step further. Norton and Arelli then, using that same thing, graphed what in fact income inequality actually is in the United States, and that's what it actually is. Okay, so vastly underestimate. Even when we say we think that it's unequal, we are vastly unaware of exactly how unequal it is. And again, if you watch this video, you see actually the top of the graph goes way actually out of sight. Okay, and so it is way different than what we actually think that it is. Okay, so what's going on here? Why aren't we more upset by this then, right? So if we know that there's contradiction between what we think it should be and what it is, why aren't we more upset? Or why aren't we doing some things about this? And I think we turn to our legitimizing ideologies here. I think that helps explain some of this. Is we also have a really strong belief in mobility, right? And this idea that people should be able to move between different income levels, right? And this strong belief in mobility actually, I think, inhibits our desire for having incomes be more equal. And this is despite the fact that we're wrong here too, right? Not a surprise. We're actually wrong in terms of how much mobility we think that there is. There's significantly less mobility than we actually think there is. And there's a really nice Pew study here that actually illustrates that in fact, although if you sort of go across generations, current generations doing better than past generations, sort of on average, if you sort of put people on a ladder, there is what they call stickiness at the top and the bottom. Those who are born at the top, much more likely to stay at the top. Those at the bottom, much more likely to stay at the bottom. The only place where you're seeing really true mobility is right there in the middle. And when I say true mobility, what they find is that people are equally likely to go up as they are to go down. And I think that's a really important point to hold for 1 second, right? When we think about mobility, we typically think about the up part, right? When we think about we want mobility, we're thinking upward mobility, not so much about that downward mobility. All right, so in terms then of the experience of inequality, what does inequality do to us? So coming out of largely, lots of the data is coming out of health disparities research here. So what is the consequence of inequality for our health? And again, the research here is pretty consistent. It's not good. In fact, it's very, very bad. We have much higher rates of chronic diseases when we're in societies that have higher rates of income inequality. We have shorter lifespans. And again, I think this is where psychologists are playing a really important role here, that it's not just that the income that you have is important, but it's the feeling that you have less than those around you. Right? So for example, if you have someone who has the same amount of income in two different societies, so let's say I have $50,000 in this society, $50,000 in this society, in a society that has an equal distribution of wealth, I don't feel like I'm missing out a whole lot. Okay? In this other society that there's great inequality, right, I can see that there's a lot of difference, right, that I feel like I have less than others around me. And one of the better predictors of some of these negative health consequences is that feeling that in fact we have less than the people around us. Okay. So overall, I think it's really important here is sort of the takeaway, again, in terms of thinking about that this is not just an issue of people at the lower end of the economic scale, that inequality actually hurts all of us, right? So when I was giving that health evidence, that's not just for the people at the bottom, that's for people throughout the society, right? Our health is worse in unequal societies. Okay, so now thinking about sort of agenda, what do we need to do? Where does the science need to go? I do think that we need to think beyond relative rank here. So a lot of the literature in inequality is really wonderful, and I think it's getting us to think about this feeling that in fact you don't have to necessarily be poor in order to feel poor to have some negative consequences. But again, obviously this coming out of relative deprivation literature, right? Literature that we've known for a very long time. But I'm a little bit worried about our generalizability here. So a lot of this research is done where we don't really have the top of the ladder and we don't really have the bottom of the ladder. And in particular, my concern connects back to what I was telling you about the literature on scarcity, right? And let me actually pause for a second. If you don't know this Sears article where he's talking about college sophomores and our generalizability, this is one of those articles that I tend to think has really stood the test of time. So many, many years later, a lot of his recommendations and a lot of his analysis still holds true. So again, I recommend that to you if you've not read that Sears article. The gist of which is that we know an awful lot about people who are really good at doing cognitive tasks, right? So a lot of our base is on college students, and this has been true over time. But if we also have learned for our scarcity literature that in fact having scarce resources affects our cognitive abilities, right? So if we're then ignoring the bottom of the scale, the people who actually are actually scarce on resources, not just feeling scarce on resources, there could be a potential problem here in terms of our generalizability. So I think we just need to pay attention to it. In terms of increasing our intersectionality focus, I actually think this is actually one of our more intersectional areas in lots of ways because of coming out of some of this health disparities research. But I think we need to continue to increase our intersectionality focus, and there is lots of good research here that's looking at the confluence of race and class and gender as well. So I think we need to continue to complicate our literature in that way. Finally, I think we need to utilize some of our groups literature, right? So we have a vast literature on looking at groups. And yet a lot of times in some of this research, we're really treating people as if they're individuals, as if they're not part of a larger group. And I don't want us to lose that group focus. I think in terms of this intergroup contact and conflict and cooperation literature, again, I think if we want to think about class in the same sort of way, we certainly talk in the media about class conflict, but I'm not sure how much our research is actually showing about thinking about people in sort of this group context as well. All right, starting to wrap up, I promise. So just a few more things in terms of thinking about our science as a whole. So I have this opportunity, I'm going to talk just a little bit about a couple of things that I think are science as a whole in terms of thinking about our science of social class. The American Psychological Association, the Office on Socioeconomic Status, has had a campaign for a while now that they had termed Stop Skipping Class. And the idea behind here is really to encourage publishers to ask for some class information about the samples, as well as to encourage researchers to actually collect that data. Okay, and ultimately what this is trying to get at, it would seem unreasonable to us to submit a manuscript these days without reporting the gender of the sample, or the ethnicity or race of the sample, or the age of the sample. And yet we will consistently not report the social class of the sample, despite the fact that we know that social class interacts with a bunch of these different factors. Okay, and so, in terms of thinking about this campaign, really what the encouragement is, if you are a publisher or you work with a journal, to think about asking your authors for this information. But I'm more talking to the students in the audience, and it is much easier to start at the beginning of designing your study to include it than to have to get a revise and resubmit to collect some more data because you don't have social class information. And in some ways, excuse me, if we can't convince the editors to ask you for it, I'm going to the people, right? If you start to collect it, right, then we can start to push them to actually ask for it as well. Because I really think also in terms of replication, thinking about replication crisis in our field, I think as long as we continue to not collect information on social class, we're still going to run into some of these same kind of problems, because I think some of the things we're seeing are a result of different social class samples. All right, sorry, a little bit of water. All right, so just a couple other best practices here. So some of the pushback oftentimes when I've said this to people is, but you know, Wendy, social class, that's so complicated, right? There's so many different ways that you can measure it, okay? And in fact, if you're concerned about this, there actually is, the Steamer article is a really wonderful article to give you some tips on some of the best practices in using social class variables. So I recommend that to you. But my first response also is, when has this group ever shied away from complicated things, right? So this doesn't seem to me like something that we say, oh no, this is just too complicated, we can't do it. I think that we can do it. I also think, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase Voltaire here, I think this is one of those cases where the perfect is the enemy of the good, right? So I think as long as we continue to say, well, what if I don't get the right one, or what if this is not perfect, that allows us, that sort of lets us off the hook of collecting some information. And we know, right, so we love our meta-analysis, right? Let our meta-analysis ultimately sort it out, right? But if we're never collecting the data, we will never know the answers. All right, and just a plug here for also in terms of if you're new to this research, again, some best practices that I think are important to hit home. Using first-person language. So a lot of times what I find in this literature is that we tend to dehumanize the people that we're talking about, especially people who have less resources. That we tend to use code words for things. So people use the word ghetto when really what they mean is a low-income, community of color, urban kind of sample. If that's what you mean, just say that, right? I think we need to be specific. I think we need to be less afraid of being wordy, and I think we need to put some of our humanity back in our science here. And the last piece of this too is I think we need to avoid some pejoratives, and I think this is one of the things that a lot of times people don't know that it's pejorative.